A geriatric hospital ward in Northampton, 1977. A nursing home in Santa Monica. A grave in Padua, no surviving child attended. 3 women, 3 institutions, 3 quiet endings. But once they had been the most painted faces of an entire age, dukes married them for their beauty. Architects bankrolled them in private apartments. Princes sold their titles for their dowries, and when the era that priced them found a younger face, the men who owned the deeds quietly stopped paying. Tonight, the 3 women the Gilded Age used up and threw away. 3 case studies and the only currency the Gilded Age priced higher than steel. If you like history that has nothing to do with the polished version, museums put behind glass, hit subscribe so the next forgotten woman lands in front of you on time. Chapter 1. The American Girl, Proust. Watched in Paris. In the spring of 1901, a 20-year-old Bostonian was being followed home from the Louvre by half the Faubourg Saint-Germain. Her name was Gladys Marie Deacon. She had been born on the 7th of February 1881, in the Avenue d'Iéna, to a Boston American father whose family money was already in its last generation, and a half-French mother who had grown up in Versailles. By the time she was 10, her father had murdered her mother's French lover in a hotel room in Cannes, served prison time for the killing in a Marseille fortress, and emerged from confinement noticeably mad. Henry James, the novelist, knew the family. He thought of basing a novel on the murder, and abandoned the idea because the facts were stronger than any fiction he was prepared to write. Gladys was raised in salons and on trains. She spoke French, English, German, Italian, and ancient Greek by the time she was 16. At 15, she was already at the center of a small circle of older men of letters who could not stop looking at her. The art historian Bernard Berenson met her in Florence when she was 17. He wrote later, in private, that she was the most disturbing girl he had ever met, by which he meant the most attractive. He courted her, intermittently, for the next 6 years, in the way a married scholar courts a teenager he has decided to admire from a permitted distance. He gave up at last because, in his own bitter phrase, she was incapable of standing still. Marcel Proust met her at a salon dinner when she was about 22. He recorded in a letter what is now the most quoted single sentence ever written about her face. "I never saw a girl," he wrote, "with such beauty, such magnificent intelligence, such goodness and charm." The dandy poet Robert de Montesquieu, who was the original of Proust's Baron de Charlus, compared her to an archangel. The Crown Prince of Prussia, Wilhelm, met her in Berlin in 1901. He proposed to her within the year. His mother, the German Empress Augusta Victoria, intervened. The German court asked, through diplomatic channels, for the return of a ring he had given her. She returned it. She kept the correspondence. Edith Wharton had her to dinner in Paris. The Crown Princess of Greece invited her to Athens. The Vatican once sent a discreet inquiry about whether she might be interested in a private audience with the Pope. She was 23. It is worth pausing here to say what it is we are looking at. We are looking at the absolute peak of a particular Gilded Age trade. Between roughly 1880 and 1914, the courts of Europe, the salons of Paris, and the great country houses of England were running on a continual transatlantic transfer of American industrial money. The wealthy Americans were sending their daughters across. The European nobility was sending its titles back. The exchange rate was specific. A duke could be obtained for a settlement of around $2 million American dollars in 1895 money. An earl could be had for around 500,000. A Belgian or Italian princeling could be had for substantially less. The traffic in young women between the United States and Europe in this window has been estimated by the social historian Sven Beckert and others at between $1.5 and $3 billion of inherited American capital transferred in less than 35 years. Gladys was not, strictly speaking, in that market. She was a different product. She was the rarer thing, the woman whose only liquid asset was her face. The Deacon Trust by the early 1900s had been emptied by her father's legal fees and by her mother's expenses. There was no Boston dowry to mortgage. There was only Gladys. She knew this. Her diary entries from the period are unsentimental about it. She wrote in 1902, at 21, that she intended to marry the highest title in Europe she could find, and she intended to do it not for the money, but for the position, because the position would protect her face. Note the verb. The position would protect her face. Even at 21, she already understood, on some instinctive level, that the face was the asset, that the asset would not last, and that the only durable shelter she could construct for it was a great house and a great family. She had decided on the Duke of Marlborough by 1903. Marlborough was then married to the American heiress Consuelo Vanderbilt, the daughter of William Kissam Vanderbilt, whose Paris dowry of $2,500,000 in cash, plus a settled annual income of $100,000 in 1895, money had funded most of a generation of repairs at Blenheim Palace. The Marlborough marriage was, by 1903, already over in private. They lived in separate wings. Gladys waited. She waited for 16 years. She turned down at least 3 documented proposals while she was waiting. She maintained, throughout the wait, the constellation of male admirers around her, in part because the admiration kept the face famous, and in part because she enjoyed it. She kept the face famous because she was going to need it intact for the moment Marlborough was finally free. She did not know, when she made that calculation at 21, what she was about to do to it. Chapter 2. The Syringe That Took Her Face. At 22, she walked into a Paris consulting room, paid a discreet doctor, and asked him to inject hot paraffin wax into the bridge of her nose. She wanted what every woman in her circle that year wanted: the perfect straight Grecian profile that ran from the brow to the tip of the nose in a single uninterrupted line. The classical sculptures of the Louvre had it. The Boldini portraits of the season had it. The fashion plates of Worth had it. Real noses did not, quite. Gladys's own nose had a slight, fashionable curve at the bridge that, on close inspection, made her face less than perfect. She intended to correct it. The medical context is worth understanding in detail because the procedure she submitted to was already being abandoned by surgeons who knew better. The use of injectable paraffin wax for cosmetic alteration of the human face had been pioneered in the late 1890s by Robert Gersuni, a Viennese surgeon, who had used heated paraffin to reshape patients' noses, breasts, and chins. By 1903, when Gladys submitted to the procedure, the medical journals of Paris, Vienna, and Berlin were already publishing case reports of disastrous outcomes. Paraffin, once cooled inside the human body, did not stay where it was injected. It migrated. It moved with gravity. It moved with body heat. It formed hardened masses called paraffinomas in the surrounding tissue. By the 1920s, the procedure had been almost entirely abandoned in respectable European medicine. By the 1930s, it was being used as a textbook example of what cosmetic surgery should never do. Gladys was 22. She did not know any of this. She walked in, paid the doctor, lay down on the table, and submitted to a hot syringe being pressed into the bridge of her nose. The wax was heated until it was molten. It was injected slowly into the soft tissue. The doctor pressed it into the desired shape. He told her to lie still while it set. He told her she was a perfect candidate for the procedure. He told her there would be some swelling, which would pass. For the first 10 years, it appeared to work. The new Grecian profile arrived. Boldini painted her in 1908 in the great swirling portrait now hanging in the Petit Palais in Paris. And the nose in the Boldini is the engineered nose. It is the nose she had paid for. It is the nose she had built. It is one of the most reproduced female faces of the Edwardian era. It is also, in retrospect, the last good photographic season of her life. By 1912, the migration had begun. It was not dramatic, it was slow. The hardened paraffin moved downwards, very gradually, with each passing month. By her early 30s, she had a small visible lump in her upper lip, which she covered with a hand when she spoke. By her mid-30s, she had a larger lump on the side of her chin, which she could not cover. By her late 30s, the entire lower half of her face had a fixed, lumpy, irregular set to it, particularly under strong light, which no makeup could hide. She knew. She watched it happen, very slowly, in the mirror every morning for almost 20 years. She had decided at 21 that her face was her only durable asset. She now had to watch her only durable asset visibly fail in front of her. There is a particular small detail from her 30s that ought to be paused on because it tells you everything about the inside of her head at this point. She kept a series of small handwritten notes about which photographers she would and would not permit to photograph her. After 1915, the list of permitted photographers shrinks rapidly. After 1920, it is empty. There are almost no photographs of Gladys Deacon between the age of 39 and her death at 96. She had refused them. She had refused the existence of any photographic record of what had happened to her face after the wax migrated. This is why almost every image of her that survives in popular knowledge is from before 1915. She had managed her own erasure. The marriage to Marlborough, when it finally arrived in 1921, occurred against this backdrop. She was 40 by the time the divorce of Marlborough from Consuelo Vanderbilt was finalized in 1920, and the new wedding took place in June 1921 in Paris. She was, in her own private accounting, already late. The face was already going. She knew it. He, the Duke, did not yet, because he was looking at the Boldini portrait, not at the woman. She moved into Blenheim Palace in the autumn of 1921. She brought with her dogs, her books, her Rodin bust, her Boldini, and a series of small, increasing instructions to the staff. The first instruction, given within months of her arrival, was that every mirror in her private apartments was to be removed. The order was given to the head housekeeper. The mirrors were taken down. There were 11 of them. They were stored in a sealed room in the West Wing. She never asked for one back. She had moved into a house that had at least 476 mirrors by the 1920s inventory. She lived in it for the next 13 years without looking into a single one. Chapter 3. The Duke Who Married a Portrait. Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, had married Consuelo Vanderbilt for the money, and now he wanted to marry Gladys Deacon for the face. He was 49 years old. She was 40. The wedding took place at the British Embassy in Paris on the 25th of June, 1921. The bride wore Worth. The honeymoon was at the Hotel Crillon and at Aix-les-Bains. The press described it as a love match, although nothing about the documented correspondence of either party suggests that was true. It is necessary to understand the inside of Marlborough's head at this point, because if Gladys was running a beauty calculation, Marlborough was running a property calculation, and the property calculation was an old one. Blenheim Palace had been built between 1705 and 1722 by the first Duke of Marlborough, John Churchill, as a national gift from a grateful Queen Anne for his victory at the Battle of Blenheim against the French in 1704. Van Brugge had designed it. Hawksmoor had supervised the building. The house had 187 rooms, 2,100 acres, a private lake designed by Capability Brown, and the largest single private library in England outside the British Museum. By the late 1880s, it was nearly bankrupt. The dukes of the late Victorian period had spent more on horses and on Conservative Party politics than they had collected in rents. The 8th Duke had auctioned off significant pieces of the picture collection in 1884, including, notoriously, the Marlborough gems. The 9th Duke, Charles, inherited a house he could not afford. The marriage to Consuelo Vanderbilt in November 1895 was, in pure financial terms, the saving of Blenheim. The dowry of $2,500,000 in cash, plus a settled annual income of $100,000 in 1895 money, plus a personal trust on Consuelo's life of an additional similar size, made it possible for him to repair the roof, the windows, the 8 bedrooms in the state apartments, the family wing, the chapel, the great staircase, and the staff hall. By the time of his divorce from Consuelo in 1920, Blenheim was again a habitable great house. He owed her, in a strict financial accounting, the survival of the property. He took the money. He never forgave her for it. The marriage to Consuelo had been miserable for both parties, by all surviving accounts, and Marlborough's documented treatment of her in the early 1900s was cold, occasionally cruel, and consistently focused on what she had cost him in dignity to obtain. When he married Gladys, he believed he was, for the second time in his life, marrying an asset. The asset this time was the face, which was world famous, and the social position the face would deliver in London society. He had calculated that with Gladys at Blenheim, the parties he could throw would draw the Prince of Wales, the King of Italy, and the cream of the British aristocracy. The repaired Blenheim plus the famous beauty plus the title equaled an Edwardian social engine. He did not know about the wax. For the first 3 years of the marriage, the engine ran. Gladys hosted with great skill. She drew the Crown Prince of Italy. She drew the Prince of Wales. She drew Lord Curzon. She drew Marcel Proust by correspondence. She drew Berenson on visits. The dinners were small, deliberate, and impeccably calibrated. She could speak any of 5 languages with the most senior diplomatic guests. The Boldini portrait hung in the long library, and the woman who had sat for the portrait stood at the head of the dinner table beneath it. Then, slowly, the lump in the upper lip became visible to the dinner guests. Then, slowly, the lump on the lower jaw became visible. Then, slowly, the photographs that other people brought to the house began to come back with a small private comment, given in private letters to friends, that the Duchess was no longer quite the woman of the great portrait. By 1926, Marlborough had begun to invent reasons not to come down for dinner. By 1927, he was sleeping in a separate wing. By 1928, he was openly absent from the house for weeks at a time. By 1929, he was reported by visiting friends to be considering a third marriage. By 1930, he had instructed the head housekeeper, in writing, that the Duchess's rooms in the family wing were to be sealed off from the state apartments and that her access to the central staff was to be limited to her own private maid. She knew. She wrote in a private letter of 1930 to a friend in Paris that her husband no longer recognized her in his own house. She did not mean it metaphorically. She meant that when they passed each other in the central corridor, he averted his eyes and walked through. In the autumn of 1932, she filled the long library with her dogs. She had at this point 13 of them. They were Pekingese and 1 stray spaniel. They were not house-trained. They climbed on the 18th century furniture. They climbed on the Boldini. They climbed on the dinner table. Marlborough's complaints about the dogs, given through the head housekeeper, were dismissed by the Duchess. The dogs stayed. In the spring of 1933, Marlborough left Blenheim and moved permanently to his London house in Carlton House Terrace. He instructed his solicitor to begin divorce proceedings. The proceedings stalled. He died suddenly of pneumonia at Carlton House Terrace on the 30th of June, 1934. Gladys was 53. She had been married to Blenheim for 13 years and married to the Wax for 30. Marlborough's will, dictated in his last 6 months, made no significant provision for her. The new 10th Duke arrived at Blenheim within the month. He requested politely that the Dowager Duchess remove herself and her dogs from the palace. She refused. He requested again. She refused again. In the autumn of 1934, the new Duke's solicitor evicted her, also politely, but with the full backing of the trustees of the estate. She left Blenheim in November 1934 with her dogs, her Boldini, her Rodin, her books, and 1 trunk of personal effects. She moved to a rented cottage in North Oxfordshire. The cottage was small, isolated, surrounded by fields, and there were no mirrors in it. Chapter 4. 15 years in a public ward. In 1962, after a neighbor reported a smell, a single trustee's signature put the 81-year-old Dowager Duchess of Marlborough into a public ward in Northampton. The trustee was a distant cousin of the Marlborough line. The committal papers were filed under the English Mental Health Act of 1959. The grounds given were self-neglect, inability to manage her own affairs, and the recommendation of the local general practitioner that she could no longer be left alone at the Grange. The Grange was a small farmhouse cottage near the village of Chacombe in North Oxfordshire, about 24 miles from Blenheim, where Gladys had been living for the previous 28 years. It had 2 rooms downstairs and 3 upstairs. She had moved into it in 1934, after the eviction from Blenheim, and she had lived in it without leaving for almost 3 decades. By the late 1950s, the cottage contained, among other things, an estimated 47 cats, 4 surviving dogs, an unpolished Rodin bronze bust of Aphrodite that had been a gift from the sculptor in 1906, the Boldini portrait of her at 27 that now hangs in the Petit Palais in Paris, an estimated 3,000 books in 5 languages, 6 trunks of letters, an unfired loaded revolver in her bedroom, and herself. She had not been seen in public since 1937. She did not answer the telephone. She did not open the door. She did not employ a servant. She did her own washing in a tin basin in the kitchen. She ate cold tinned food. She read by candlelight because she had not paid the electricity bill in 11 years. She wrote letters on heavy old Marlborough stationery in 5 languages to philosophers and historians and members of her surviving circle in Paris and Florence. The letters arrived at their destinations and were read with bewilderment because no one had heard from her for 30 years, and the letters were as lucid, as cold, as intelligent and as biting as the letters of her 20s. She was not mad. She was not even, in the medical sense of the period, demented. She was an extraordinarily intelligent woman of 81 who had decided she preferred her cats to the world and her books to her visitors, and who had organized her life around that preference for 30 years. The trustee's signature changed that. She was moved in November 1962 from the Grange to St. Andrew's Hospital in Northampton. St. Andrew's was and is a long-stay psychiatric hospital. It had been founded in 1838 as the Northampton General Lunatic Asylum. It was, in the 1960s, a private charitable foundation, and it had over the years housed a number of well-known patients, including the poet John Clare, the religious mystic Mary Ann Gerling, and Lucia Joyce, the daughter of the novelist James Joyce. Gladys arrived in the public ward. She was placed in a bed in a row of beds. She was issued a hospital nightdress. Her books, her Boldini, her Rodin, her cats, and her dogs were not permitted to come with her. She lived in that ward for 15 years. The biographer Hugo Vickers gained access to her in 1974. He had read about her by accident in an old footnote to the Marlborough family tree. He had assumed she was long dead. He discovered that she was, in fact, 93 years old and still on the same public ward at St. Andrew's. He wrote to her. To his astonishment, she wrote back. The handwriting was the firm Edwardian copperplate of an educated woman of 1904. The content was clear, intelligent, and amused. She invited him to visit. He drove up. He was shown to the ward. He was asked to wait while a nurse fetched her. He waited. The nurse returned. The nurse said the Duchess would see him now. He looked up. There, walking very slowly across the ward in a hospital nightgown and a faded silk dressing gown, was a tiny old woman with bright crystal blue eyes, an erect spine, and the surviving traces of one of the most famous faces of the Edwardian era. The lower half of the face was, as he later wrote, a small disordered shape that did not entirely belong to the rest of the head. The eyes were still hers. She talked to him for several hours. She talked again, on subsequent visits for the next 2 years. She remembered Berenson. She remembered Proust. She remembered Boldini at work on the portrait. She remembered the Crown Prince of Prussia and the ring. She did not talk about Marlborough at all. She died on the 13th of October, 1977, on the public ward, aged 96. The cause was old age. The nurses were sorry. They had liked her. They had not realized who she had been. Vickers's biography, The Sphinx, appeared in 1979. It is the only proper account of her life. It is also, in a sense, the only thing about her that survived. The Boldini portrait, which had been auctioned off from the Grange when the cottage was emptied after her death, was bought by the city of Paris and is now in the Petit Palais. The Rodin bust was bought by a private collector. The cats and dogs were rehomed. The estate, after the auction of the books and the portrait, came to under £9,000. The 81-year-old woman, who had been put into the public ward in 1962, had been the heir to no significant trust. And the woman who had been the Duchess at Blenheim had been allowed by the system to vanish into a row of beds in Northampton, without anybody in the Marlborough family stopping it. Her grave is in the village churchyard at Chacombe. The grave is unmarked. There is no headstone. There is no inscription. There is simply a slight rise in the grass next to a yew tree. She was the woman who tried to do everything correctly inside the system. The system had warehoused her first. It is Chapter 5. The Pittsburgh Girl Manhattan Bought. When Evelyn Nesbit arrived in New York in 1901, she was the fatherless daughter of a Pittsburgh laundress, and inside, a year she was the most photographed woman in the United States. She was 16 years old, possibly only 15. The exact birth date is disputed. The most credible date, given by the biographer Paula Uriburu, is the 25th of December, 1884, although Evelyn's mother frequently added years to her daughter's age to circumvent child labor laws, and Evelyn herself sometimes subtracted them. She was small, dark-haired, with very large dark eyes, an oval face, and a particular quality of expression in photographs that the New York illustrators of the period found extraordinarily reproducible. She was, in a phrase the Madison Avenue advertising industry would not invent for another 40 years, a face that printed well. The financial story behind her arrival was the small Gilded Age tragedy. Her father, Winfield Scott Nesbitt, had been a Pittsburgh attorney with a modestly successful practice and a modestly respectable house in the Allegheny suburb of Tarentum. He had died when Evelyn was about 11, of a sudden illness with debts. The debts swallowed the house, the furniture, the practice, and his small life insurance. Evelyn's mother, Florence Mackenzie Nesbitt, was left with 2 children, no income, no profession, and a social position she had not been trained to maintain. She moved the family from boarding house to boarding house. She took in washing, she took in sewing. She tried briefly to run a boarding house herself, and failed within a year. By the time Evelyn was 14, the family was, in plain language, destitute. The mother had concluded that the only assignable financial asset the family possessed was the daughter's face. The daughter had been informed. The Pittsburgh artist Violet Oakley discovered Evelyn first, around 1899, when Evelyn was about 14, and used her as a model for a series of stained glass commissions. The fee was small, but it was the first money the family had taken in for months. Florence Nesbitt, the mother, drew a conclusion. She packed up the family and moved to Philadelphia, where the illustrators paid better. She moved on to New York, where the illustrators paid better still. By the autumn of 1901, Evelyn was sitting for Frederick Stewart Church, for James Carroll Beckwith, for Carl Blenner, and most importantly, for Charles Dana Gibson. Gibson's drawing of her, in which her hair coils into a perfect black question mark and her face is turned in profile, was titled The Eternal Question. It became the most reproduced single image of an American woman in the first decade of the 20th century. It sold on postcards, it sold on calendars, it sold on tobacco premiums, it sold on advertisements for Coca-Cola, for tooth powder, for soap, for sheet music. Gibson never paid Evelyn for the use of her image. The custom of the day was that an illustrator owned the drawing absolutely, and the model was paid only for the sitting. Evelyn was paid $5 a sitting. Gibson sold the resulting drawings for hundreds. He sold the prints eventually for tens of thousands. In November 1901, the producer Owen Davis, in conjunction with the producers Claw and Erlanger, opened a Broadway musical called Florodora at the Casino Theater. The musical had originated in London, where it had been a moderate hit. The American version was structured around a sextet of 6 chorus girls who, every night, were paraded across the stage in matching pink dresses and elaborate hats. The whole business of the sextet was that the 6 women were not professional dancers. They were, in the term of the period, chorus girls. They were paid $18 a week. They were selected for the size of the audience, almost entirely male, that they could draw to the theater on the nights they appeared. Evelyn was added to the Florodora Sextet in late 1901. She was 16. The Casino Theater was, within a month, sold out for the season. The phrase Florodora girl entered the slang of the New York wealthy as a particular kind of social position. A Florodora girl was a chorus girl available, by social convention, for serious courtship from older wealthy men. The sextet was widely understood, in the language of the New York press at the time, to be the most expensive harem in Manhattan. A particular older wealthy man called Stanford White had taken an interest in Evelyn before the run opened. He was 47. He was the most celebrated architect in America. He had designed the Washington Square Arch. He had designed the second Madison Square Garden, on whose rooftop, in 4.5 years, he would be murdered. He had designed the Boston Public Library with Charles Fallon McKim. He had designed the Tiffany Building, the Players Club, the Century Club, the houses of the Astors, the houses of the Whitneys, and most of the wealthy buildings on Fifth Avenue between Madison Square and Central Park. He was married to a quiet, slightly invalid wife called Bessie. He had a son. He kept a small office on Lower Madison Avenue and a much larger private studio at 22 West 24th Street, the 3rd floor of a building he owned, in which he had installed, among other things, a red velvet swing. He met Evelyn through a Florodora girl called Edna Goodrich in August 1901 at a private lunch. He paid for the dental work she had been deferring. He paid the rent on her mother's apartment. He paid for an upright piano. He paid for clothes from the leading Fifth Avenue dressmaker. He paid, by his own internal accounting, in the way an established New York man of his class paid for a teenage chorus girl in 1901. He believed himself to be, by the standards of the men he knew, very generous. Evelyn's mother knew where the money was coming from. She let it come. By the end of 1901, the financial collapse the family had suffered after the death of the father had been entirely reversed. The new prosperity rested on a single asset. The asset was a 16-year-old girl. The asset was being assessed by Stanford White in a private studio on West 24th Street that contained a red velvet swing. Evelyn did not yet entirely understand what had been arranged. She would understand within a month. Chapter 6. The Red Velvet Swing on West 24th. In a private studio on West 24th Street, a 47-year-old married architect had installed a red velvet swing on which 16-year-old girls posed in lingerie. The swing hung from the ceiling on long red ropes. The seat was upholstered in red velvet. The room was decorated in mirrors and red silk. The girls, of whom Evelyn was only the most documented, were paid in cash or in gifts or in rent, paid on their families' apartments. They were photographed on the swing, individually, by White, with a still camera he had set up on a tripod facing the swing. The photographs were kept in a locked cupboard in the studio. After the murder, the police would find more than 200 of them. The press would refer to the swing for the next 60 years. The swing room was the public face of White's operation. The private face was a separate small room next door, fitted out as a bedroom, with mirrors on the ceiling and on the wall behind the bed. White installed 16-year-old girls in apartments around the city, paid their rent and their dentists and their dressmakers and their mothers, and brought them in turn to the back room. Evelyn testified, under oath, at the first Thaw trial in February 1907 to what happened in September 1901, when she was 16, in that back room. Her account, as she gave it to the court, was that White invited her to his studio for a small private dinner, served her a glass of champagne, which she found very strong, and that when she next regained consciousness, she was naked in the bedroom with White beside her, and that she understood at once what had occurred. She gave the testimony in a clear, frightened voice, without crying. The court record runs to several hundred pages. It is one of the most read pieces of testimony in pre-1940 American legal history. It is important to be careful about this testimony. It was given inside a trial designed to acquit the man who had shot Stanford White, by establishing that White was a sexual predator whose murder was an act of justified vengeance. The Thaw defense team had coached Evelyn. They had rehearsed her. They had chosen the questions. They had agreed in advance with her what she would and would not say. The testimony was tactical. It was also, in all probability, substantially true. The independent accounts of White's other young women from the same period, given in private letters and in subsequent interviews to journalists, line up almost exactly. White had a routine. The routine involved champagne, the swing, the back room, and a continuing financial relationship with the girl's mother. Evelyn had been processed through the routine, like several others. The routine had broken her. She did not leave. Where would she have gone? She was 16. Her mother knew where the money was coming from and approved. She was the principal earner in a family that had been destitute 6 months earlier. She continued the financial relationship with White through 1902. She left for a brief period to attend the Pomfret School in Connecticut, paid for by White. She returned to the relationship in 1903. She was about 18 when Harry Kendall Thaw began following her. Thaw was 27 years older than her on paper, although he was not in good control of himself and had the temperament of a 16-year-old. He was the heir to the Thaw coke and railroad fortune of Pittsburgh, an estate valued at his father's death in 1889 at approximately $40 million in 1889 money. His mother, Mary Copley Thaw, controlled the trust and controlled Harry. Harry had been expelled from Harvard. He had been expelled from a Pittsburgh club for whipping a stable boy. He had a documented private history by the early 1900s of taking young women to private hotel suites and whipping them with a riding crop. His mother was aware of this. His mother had, on more than one occasion, paid the families of the young women involved to remain silent. She regarded the payments as a necessary cost of preserving the family name. The family name was the Thaw name, which her husband William Thaw had built into one of the great Pennsylvania industrial fortunes through coal, coke, and the Pittsburgh and Connellsville Railroad. Harry had become, by 1903, obsessed with Evelyn. He believed her to have been corrupted by White, whom he hated, and he believed himself to be the man who could redeem her. He pursued her for 2 years. He took her to Europe. He paid for the journey. In a hotel suite at Schloss Katzenstein in Austria in 1904, he interrogated her, repeatedly, about her sexual history with White. He was not satisfied with her answers. He whipped her with a leather riding crop in the hotel suite over the course of 2 weeks. She wrote about it later in 2 memoirs. The hotel staff had heard her cries through the walls and had been instructed by Harry's secretary to ignore them. Harry's secretary was paid the equivalent of a year's wages to ignore them. She left Harry. She returned to New York. She returned briefly to the financial protection of White. White had cooled by then. He had moved on to younger girls. He continued to pay her some allowance. Then, in the spring of 1905, Harry returned to New York and proposed marriage. Mary Copley Thaw, his mother, opposed the marriage with great violence. She believed Evelyn to be a Florodora girl and the daughter of a laundress, which was both factually accurate and an absolute description of the social distance Mary regarded as unbridgeable. Harry overruled her. Harry insisted. The marriage took place in Pittsburgh on the 4th of April, 1905. Evelyn was 20. She had concluded that respectable marriage to a multimillionaire heir was the only escape from White's allowance and from the slow social trap of being a known chorus girl in her late 20s. She accepted Harry's proposal because of what it would buy her, not because of what he was. She knew exactly what he was. He had whipped her in an Austrian hotel suite the previous summer. She had married, by the end of the wedding ceremony, her second jailer. Chapter 7. The Shot at Madison Square Garden. On the rooftop of Madison Square Garden on the night of June 25, 1906, in front of an audience of 1,000, Harry Thaw walked across the floor and shot Stanford White through the eye. The rooftop theater was hosting the premiere of a light musical comedy called Mam'selle Champagne. White was sitting alone at a table near the front of the audience, watching the show, eating dinner. Evelyn was sitting at a separate table with Harry. Harry rose. He walked across the floor towards White. He took a small pistol out of his coat pocket. He stood approximately 2 feet from White's head. He fired 3 shots. The first shot went through White's eye and into his brain. White fell forward onto the table. He died instantly. The other 2 shots went into White's face. Harry stood holding the pistol. He turned to the audience and said, in a voice that several witnesses reported but no 2 reported the same way, words to the effect that White had ruined his wife. He gave the pistol to the manager. He waited for the police. It was the first major murder in American history performed in public, in front of a paying audience, in a place designed for public observation, by a man of great wealth, against a man of great fame, over a woman of great beauty. The American newspaper industry of 1906 understood instantly what it had been given. The story would run, in some American papers, on the front page every day for the next 11 months. It would be called, at the time and ever since, the trial of the century. It was the first such trial. There would, of course, be several others. Evelyn was 21 years old, and she was the most observed witness in the country, and she had not yet been told by anybody on the Thaw defense team what she would be expected to do. The Thaw defense team was hired by Mary Copley Thaw, Harry's mother, immediately. She paid them, by her own initial estimate, $300,000 in 1906 money for the first trial alone, with no agreed cap on costs. The estimated total Thaw legal expenditure across the 2 trials, the appeals, the insanity hearings, and the eventual Matawan committal hearings, was eventually placed at approximately $1 million by 1915, against a family fortune already estimated past $40 million. The defense strategy, which the team decided on within weeks, was the insanity defense built around a doctrine the New York courts had not previously accepted, called the dementia americana defense. The defense claimed that Harry, on observing that the woman he had married had been sexually used by White, had been overcome with a temporary insane rage, which was a form of American jealousy. Under the doctrine, an American husband who killed in defense of his wife's honor could not be held criminally responsible. The defense required, however, that Evelyn give testimony about the September 1901 assault by White. The testimony had to be detailed enough to drive a jury to a verdict of acquittal. It had to establish White as a moral monster. It had to establish Harry as the avenging American husband. Evelyn was 21. She had spent 5 years on Broadway and in private apartments. She understood perfectly what was being asked of her. The Thaw defense team explained to her in a meeting in the autumn of 1906 that her continued financial position after the trial depended on the verdict of acquittal. If Harry was hanged, the Thaw money would not be available to her. If Harry was committed, the Thaw money might or might not be available to her. If Harry was acquitted, the Thaw money would be made available to her in the form of a lifelong allowance. She testified. The testimony took place over 4 days in February 1907 in the New York Court of General Sessions. The courtroom was packed every day. The press galleries were packed every day. The transcripts were sold by enterprising New York stenographers in printed form on the same evening for 10 cents a copy. She gave the account of the champagne, the unconscious awakening, the September 1901 assault. She gave the account of White's continued financial support. She gave the account of Harry's tortured pursuit. She did not give the account of Harry's whipping of her at Schloss Katzenstein. The defense had instructed her not to. The first jury hung 7 for acquittal, 5 for guilty. The trial was retried in January 1908. The second jury accepted the Dementia Americana defense and returned a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. Harry was committed to the Mattawan State Hospital for the criminally insane in the Hudson Valley, not as a prisoner, but as a private patient of his family's wealth. The hospital provided him with a private suite, private meals, and a private nurse paid by the family. He was permitted under guard to leave the grounds on supervised visits. He escaped eventually in 1913, was extradited from Canada, was recommitted, was eventually released by the New York courts in 1915 on the grounds that he was no longer insane. He never lived with Evelyn again. The marriage was, in private, over from the day of the murder. He filed for divorce on the grounds of her adultery, which the courts of New York found credible on the basis of her vaudeville touring lifestyle. The divorce was finalized in 1916. Their son, Russell William Thaw, born in Berlin in October 1910 during the period of the Mattawan committal, was never recognized by Harry as his son and was never recognized by Mary Copley Thaw as her grandson. The Thaw family's position, which it maintained for the next 30 years, was that the child was either the result of a brief liaison Evelyn had had during a Mattawan visiting period, or, more cynically, of a relationship she had had with a member of the Thaw legal team. The Thaws closed the books against her in 1915, when Harry was released. The lifelong allowance that the defense team had implied at the autumn 1906 meeting was reduced to a one-off settlement of approximately $25,000. The continuing maintenance for Russell was approximately $200 a month for some years, then nothing. Evelyn was 30 years old. She had been the witness in the most observed trial in American history. She had given the testimony the family had asked her to give. She had been the wife in the marriage the family had wanted protected. She had borne the son the family refused to acknowledge. And the family had concluded that her work for them was finished, and the money was being shut off. The era's interest in her face was also nearly finished. The face was 30 years old. It was still beautiful. It was not the face that had launched the Florodora Sextet in 1901. Newer faces were on Broadway. Newer faces were in the illustrator's studios. The face she had been paid for since she was 14 was beginning to cease to be the asset it had been. She would have to find a new way to live. Chapter 8. The Money That Made Her Vanish. When the Thaw family closed its books against her, Evelyn Nesbit was 27 years old, a single mother to a son the family refused to acknowledge, and the most famous discarded face in America. She had a small settlement. She had a small allowance. She had a son in Germany she had to support. She had no living father, a mother she was estranged from, and a name that any New York or London hotel would recognize instantly. She could not work as an anonymous model. The face was too recognizable. She could only work as Evelyn Nesbit. She did the only thing the face would still permit. She went on the stage as herself. She returned to vaudeville, the American touring circuit of music halls and variety theaters that crisscrossed the country from New York to San Francisco. The vaudeville circuit had, by 1913, an institutional structure that was almost industrial. The Keith Albee circuit, the Orpheum circuit, the Pantasia's circuit. The acts moved from town to town on the railroad. Each act was given a slot on the bill of perhaps 8 to 12 minutes. The top of the bill in 1913 earned, in a major theater in a major city, between $1,500 and $3,000 a week. Evelyn Nesbit at the Hippodrome in New York in 1913 was top of the bill at $1,500 a week. Her act consisted of singing 2 short songs, dancing a brief routine, and answering, with practiced wit, a small selected set of questions about her life. The questions were rehearsed, the answers were rehearsed. The audience came not for the songs or the dance, but to see her. She was very good at it. She was also drinking. She was also taking morphine. The morphine had been prescribed to her in 1907 in the aftermath of the first trial for what her doctors had described, accurately enough, as nervous exhaustion. The drinking had begun by 1910. By 1915, the morphine dependence and the drinking were both established. She continued to work because she had to. She had a son. She had no other income. Mary Copley Thaw had cut her off. The story of the next 15 years is the story, with depressing regularity, of the steady decline of a vaudeville top of Bill Act through the contracting American touring circuit. By 1917, she was no longer top of the bill at the Hippodrome. By 1920, she was no longer top of the bill in New York. By 1922, she was playing the second-tier vaudeville houses in the Midwest, at perhaps $500 a week. By 1925, she was playing small cabarets in Chicago, Detroit, and St. Louis, at perhaps $150 a week. The face that had once sold 1 million calendars was now simply an aged version of itself, and the audiences that came to see it came principally out of cruel curiosity. On the 31st of December, 1925, after concluding a 6-week engagement at the Moulin Rouge in Chicago with a scheduled appearance in Miami the following week, she went into a small hotel room on the South Side and drank a measured bottle of household disinfectant. She had intended to die. She did not die. The hotel maid, alerted by the maid on the floor below, found her several hours later. She was hospitalized. The Chicago press carried the suicide attempt the next day. She gave one interview from the hospital in which she said that her son, Russell, then 15, in school in California, had been the reason she had taken the disinfectant and the reason she had not taken enough of it. She returned to the touring circuit within a month. There were further documented suicide attempts. There were further hospitalizations. There was a further marriage, brief in the 1920s, to a vaudeville performer named Jack Clifford, ended within several years by mutual indifference. There was the gradual rebuilding of a quieter life. By the 1940s, she had moved to Southern California, where her son Russell had become a commercial pilot. She lived in a small apartment in Los Angeles. She taught ceramics to small private classes of housewives in Hollywood. She gave occasional interviews to film historians who were beginning to think of her as one of the early film actresses, on the basis of the 6 silent films she had made between 1914 and 1922, all of which are now lost. In 1955, 20th Century Fox made a film of her life called The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing. Joan Collins played Evelyn. Ray Milland played White. Farley Granger played Thaw. Evelyn was hired at age 70 as a technical consultant on the film. She was paid $30,000. It was the largest single sum she had ever received from her own story. The Thaw family, by then in its 3rd generation, was furious about the film. They had nothing to do, by then, with whether it was made. She gave one extended interview near the end of her life to the journalist Doris Lockerman of the Atlanta Constitution in 1961. She said in the interview that she had never expected to live to old age, that she had expected to die in her 30s of one of the suicide attempts or one of the addictions, and that she had survived only because of Russell. She said she had loved Stanford White. She said she had hated Harry Thaw. She said she would not change anything because she could not. She said she had been used very early by a great many people, and that she did not blame them because they had used the only thing she had been raised to offer them. She died on the 17th of January, 1967, in a nursing home in Santa Monica of natural causes, at the age of 82. Her surviving estate, at death, came to under $7,000. Her son Russell received it. The Gibson Girl drawing, which had been done for a fee Gibson had paid her of $5, was estimated in the 1960s to have generated, in royalties to Gibson and to the publishing companies that had licensed his image bank, well over $1 million over its 6 decades of commercial life. Evelyn had received not 1 cent of those royalties. The image that had made her had been owned from the moment Gibson set pen to paper by Gibson. She had been used as the raw material of an early American visual industry. The industry had taken what it required. When the face was no longer useful, the industry had simply moved on, leaving the woman behind in a nursing home in Santa Monica with $7,000 to her name. She was the woman who never had the rank to play the system from inside. She had been the raw material. The system did not even have to discard her formally. It had simply stopped buying. Chapter 9. The $5 million probate file. When Captain Eber Brock Ward of Detroit died in 1875, his probate file ran to $5,335,940, the largest single estate in the history of the state of Michigan. The probate was filed in Wayne County. The newspapers in Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, and New York ran the story of the death and the size of the estate for several weeks. The Ward fortune, accumulated over the previous 40 years through shipping on the Great Lakes, through the Eureka Iron Works at Wyandotte on the Detroit River, through the Bay City lumber operations, and through a substantial portfolio of Detroit real estate, was the largest single private fortune in Michigan to that date. The Detroit Free Press carried, on the front page, the assertion that the captain had been the wealthiest man in the western half of the United States at the time of his death. He left a widow, his second wife Catherine Lyon Ward, and 4 surviving children. The youngest of the 4 children was a daughter named Clara Mary Ward, who at the time of his death was 1 year and 10 months old. She was born on the 17th of June, 1873. Her father died on the 2nd of January, 1875. She would, under the terms of the will, inherit a 1/4 share of the estate, in trust managed by her mother, releasing to her at the age of 21 or upon her marriage. Her share was estimated at the time of the trust at approximately $3 million in 1875 money. In contemporary value, that share was the equivalent of more than $100 million. The widow, Catherine Lyon Ward, was 27 years younger than her late husband, beautiful, intelligent, socially ambitious, and immediately Detroit's most eligible widow. She did not remain in Detroit. She moved to Toronto. She moved to New York. She moved to London. She moved to Paris. She enrolled Clara, when Clara was about 8, in the most expensive French convent school for foreign daughters, then in a Belgian finishing school, then in a Paris finishing school for the daughters of continental and American wealth. She trained Clara to be a girl who would be sold into the European nobility. The training was not a metaphor. It was a daily curriculum. The schools taught the calling card protocols, the dinner protocols, the dress protocols, the conversation protocols, the dance protocols, and the small, precise gradations of nobility that a girl of the right sort would have to be able to navigate by the time she was 16. The market for American daughters in the European nobility was, by the late 1880s, fully established. The first great transatlantic dollar princess marriage, Jenny Jerome of New York to Lord Randolph Churchill of England, had taken place in 1874. By the 1880s, perhaps 50 such marriages a year were taking place. The price list was widely understood inside the marriage market itself. A duke required between $1.5 and $2.5 million, transferred either as a dowry or as a settled annuity. An earl required about $500,000. A French marquis required perhaps $200,000. A Belgian or Italian princeling required perhaps $100,000 to $200,000. Catherine Lyon Ward had $3 million to play with, and a beautiful, obedient daughter, and the patience to wait for the right offer. The offer came from the house of Caraman-Chimay. The Prince Joseph de Caraman-Chimay was 32 years old in 1890. He was the second son of the Prince of Caraman-Chimay, of one of the oldest noble lines in Belgium, descended from the Counts of Beaufort and from the Tours et Tassy postal princes of the Holy Roman Empire. The Caraman-Chimay family owned a small palace in the country at Chimay, in Hainaut, a smaller townhouse in Brussels, the right to a court appearance, a great quantity of ancient furniture, several armorial tapestries, and almost no cash. The Belgian family was, at that point, genuinely poor. They needed an American daughter, or a German daughter, or an English daughter with money. Joseph met Clara in Paris in the early spring of 1890. Clara was 16. He was 32, 24 years older than her, in slightly indifferent health, with the careful, distant manners of a continental aristocrat who had spent his life in family houses. He was, by all accounts, polite to her. He was not by any account in love with her. The negotiations were carried out on the Belgian side by Joseph's mother, and on the American side by Catherine Lyon Ward. The dowry was settled at between $300,000 and $500,000 in cash, paid on the wedding day, with an additional annual income from the trust principal of perhaps $50,000 a year. The diamonds were extra. Catherine Lyon Ward presented her daughter as a wedding gift, with a tiara reportedly valued at $100,000 in 1890 money. The figure ran in the Detroit Free Press and the New York Times. The wedding took place on the 30th of May, 1890, in the chapel of the Papal Nunciature in Paris, performed by the Cardinal Archbishop of Paris in person. The bride was 16 years old. The groom was 32. The bride wore a Worth gown of white satin embroidered in pearls, designed in the 1890 silhouette with a high collar and a long train of approximately 6 meters. The bride wore the new tiara. The bride wore 3 strands of South Sea pearls. The bride was photographed for the front pages of 3 continental papers and 4 American papers. The groom was photographed in the uniform of a Belgian colonel of artillery, which he had never seen active service in. The reception was given at the Hôtel Crillon in the Place de la Concorde. The wedding presents were exhibited for 2 days in a private room at the Crillon with a printed catalogue. The bride was instructed by her mother to smile and to keep her hand on the groom's arm during the photographs. The bride did so. The groom did so. They left the Crillon the next day for the Château of Chimay in Hainaut. The Princesse de Caraman-Chimay, of an ancient Belgian princely line, 6 meters of train, $100,000 of diamonds, was 16 years old, and she was already very bored. Chapter 10. The Night the Orchestra played. On a November night in 1896, at a small table at the Café de Paris, Clara Ward looked across the dining room at a 27-year-old Hungarian violinist named Rigo Janci, and decided to dynamite her own life. The Café de Paris was the most fashionable restaurant in the city. It stood on the Boulevard des Italiens. It had been founded in 1822. It seated in its principal dining room perhaps 200 guests. It had, in the 1890s, a small private orchestra in the corner that provided dinner music. On certain nights, the orchestra was supplemented by visiting musicians from the continental capitals, which, on this November night, happened to include a small Hungarian Romani ensemble brought in for the season by the restaurant management. The ensemble was led by a slim, dark, 27-year-old violinist with the long, curling mustaches of the Hungarian musician of the period, with very fast hands, with very dark eyes, and with the name Rigo Janci. Clara was 23. She had been Princess de Caraman-Chimay for 6 years. She had borne 2 children, Marie, born in 1891, and Joseph, born in 1894. She had a Brussels townhouse. She had a Hainaut chateau. She had a husband she did not love, and who, as far as the documentary record permits a conclusion, did not love her. She had given the Belgian family the cash they had wanted. The family had given her, in exchange, the title and the cold formal distance which had become, by 1906, intolerable to her. The prince had taken several mistresses in the continental aristocratic style, which Clara was not expected to notice. She had taken no lovers. She was bored to the point of physical discomfort. She and the prince were eating, with another aristocratic couple, at the Café de Paris. The orchestra was playing a Liszt Sardas. Clara turned, looked across the dining room, and saw Rigo. He was looking at her over the bow of his violin. He continued to look. He held the look for the length of the piece. The Sardas ended. He bowed to the audience. He bowed, particularly, to Clara. The prince did not appear to notice. She arranged the next afternoon to send Rigo a note via a discreet servant. The note proposed a meeting. The meeting took place in a hotel room. The meetings continued in different hotel rooms, 2 and 3 times a week for the next 6 weeks. The prince did not notice, or pretended not to notice. The Brussels and Paris servants did not appear to notice, or were paid not to appear to notice. The Café de Paris management did not notice, or were paid not to notice. On the 18th of December, 1896, in the Gare de Lyon in Paris, Clara Ward, the Princesse de Caraman-Chimay, met Rigo Janci at the platform. They boarded the express to Budapest. They eloped. Clara left behind in the Brussels townhouse. the prince, the chateau, the 2 children, the Worth wardrobe, and the tiara. She took with her, in 2 pieces of luggage, a small purse of cash, her own jewelry box, and approximately 75,000 French francs in available funds drawn against the trust. She did not communicate the elopement to her mother. She did not communicate it to the prince. The Brussels servants discovered her absence the next morning. The prince was notified by telegram in the evening. The Belgian press picked up the story within 48 hours. The Paris press picked it up within 72 hours. The New York Times ran the elopement on the front page on the 23rd of December, 1896. The Ludington Record of Ludington, Michigan, ran the elopement on the 24th of December, 1896, with a woodcut illustration of Clara's face and the headline, "Gone with a Gypsy." The American press of December 1896 and January 1897 ran the story, in some papers, every single day for 6 weeks. Clara Ward had become, overnight, the most discussed runaway heiress in the world. The Belgian divorce was granted on the 19th of January, 1897. The grounds were the desertion. The prince retained custody of the 2 children. The prince retained in the settlement no further obligation to Clara, and Clara retained, in the settlement, the principal of her own American trust. The Belgian court stripped her of the princely title. She could no longer style herself the Princesse de Caraman-Chimay in any Belgian or French legal document. The Belgian press, with great enthusiasm, took up the new naming convention. She was now, in the Belgian society columns, simply Clara Ward, with no title at all. She did not appear to mind. She married Rigaud in Hungary in the spring of 1897 in a small civil ceremony. She was 23. She had been a Belgian princess for almost 7 years. She was now a Hungarian musician's wife. She had abandoned 2 children under the age of 6. She had abandoned a 6-meter train and a tiara and a house. She had abandoned the formal apparatus of a princely line. She had not, however, abandoned the visual industry that had described her for the previous 7 years. The visual industry, the photographic studios of Paris, Vienna, Budapest, Berlin, and London, were, if anything, more interested in her than they had been before. The Princesse de Caraman-Chimay had been a slight curiosity. The runaway American heiress who had abandoned a Belgian princely line for a Romani violinist was a sensation. Photographic studios paid her to sit. The Toulouse-Lautrec lithograph Idylle Princière of 1897 depicted Clara and Rigaud at a small Hungarian table with great satirical force. The lithograph circulated in 3 languages. The illustrated press of 3 countries reprinted variations of it for the next 2 years. Clara discovered, at 23, that she was, for the first time in her life, a recognized public figure in her own right rather than as the wife of someone. She did not entirely understand what to do with this. She decided, on instinct, to monetize it. She decided to go on the stage. The decision was, in the language of the Belgian and Detroit wards of the 1890s, social suicide. Catherine Lyon Ward in Detroit refused to receive her daughter again. The Belgian ward-in-laws did the same. The American ward cousins in Detroit refused to acknowledge her name in correspondence. She was, by the early summer of 1897, formally socially dead in 3 countries. She did not appear to mind. She continued. Chapter 11. Naked on the stage of the Folies. Bergère. Within a year of her divorce, the woman the Belgian court had presented as the future of an ancient line was performing semi-nude tableaux on the stage of the Folies Bergère. The Folies Bergère was the most famous music hall in Paris. It had been opened in 1869. By the 1890s, it was producing every evening a program of music, dance, acrobatics, and tableaux vivants for an audience that ran from the Parisian aristocracy through the foreign tourist trade. The tableau vivant, the living picture, was a particular Belle Époque speciality in which a female performer in a heavy costume, partially translucent, partially painted to suggest classical nudity, would stand absolutely still in front of a painted backdrop and reproduce, in the flesh, a famous classical painting or a famous classical sculpture. The most successful tableaux vivants of the 1890s used celebrity performers whose names the audience recognized. The audience came not for the artistry, which was minimal, but for the recognized face. Clara was perfect for it. She was a recognized face in 3 countries. She was a famous beauty. She was a famous scandal. She had, the management of the Foleys could plausibly claim, given up an entire princely position for love, which made her presence on the stage a kind of romantic spectacle in itself. She agreed terms with the Foleys in the summer of 1897. She agreed to a series of tableaux vivants based on classical paintings. The costumes, designed by the Foleys' costume department, were flesh-colored leotards painted to suggest classical nudity, which, under stage light, with carefully calculated lifting, read to the audience as fully nude. The Belgian, French, and German press described the act, with great moral outrage, as obscene. The Foleys sold out every night. She called the act poses plastiques, the contemporary French term for the genre. She performed at the Foleys for several months. She moved to the Moulin Rouge. She performed there as well. She moved to a European touring circuit that took her through Vienna, Berlin, Budapest, Brussels, where she was officially banned and performed anyway, and London. The postcards of her in costume, printed by Parisian studios and sold cheaply, circulated through Europe and America. By the autumn of 1898, her face was as widely reproduced in the cheap photographic print trade of continental Europe as Evelyn Nesbit's would be in the American calendar trade 3 years later. She was making, by the standards of the music hall economy of 1898, very good money. The top of the bill rate at the Foleys was approximately 3,000 francs a week, which Clara was paid by the second month of her run. The postcard royalties came to her direct from the Parisian print houses, perhaps another 1,000 francs a week. She was also, however, still drawing the annual income from her American trust principal, which her mother in Detroit was not in a position to cancel. The trust was protected by Michigan probate. Catherine Lyon Ward could withhold her motherly affection. She could not withhold the income. Clara was drawing perhaps another $2,000 a month in 1898 money from Detroit. She had, in pure financial terms, in the late 1890s, the most income she had ever had in her own name. She had no obligations, she had no household to run, she had no children with her, she had Rigo. Rigo did not last. He was a Romany musician of 27 who had run off with an heiress at the height of the music hall vogue. By the spring of 1899, the Foleys' money had partly gone to his head, and partly his head had gone to other women. He took, by Clara's later account, a series of mistresses among the chorus dancers. He spent her income on jewelry for the mistresses. He gambled what was left. By the end of 1904, they had separated. The divorce was granted in 1904. He went on to a respectable later career as a Hungarian Romani bandleader. He died in obscurity many years later, having outlived Clara by some decades. Clara married the same year an Italian railway employee called Peppino Ricciardo, who was younger than her by a few years and who managed in his employment the small Vesuvius tourist railway that took foreign visitors up the slopes of the volcano. The marriage was reportedly happy for a season and then, like the marriage to Rigo, dissolved. The exact date of the divorce is not in the documentary record. She is recorded as marrying a fourth time, before her death, to a Signor Casalotta, another Italian railway employee. The pattern is hard to read at this distance. It is, on its face, the pattern of a woman who had exhausted the European aristocratic line, exhausted the music hall line, and was now living a quieter life in Italy, with men whose social position was lower than hers, but whose attention was perhaps more reliably given. By 1910, the music hall career was over. The face was 37 years old. The tableau vivant industry had moved on to the next generation of dancers. The postcards were no longer reprinted. Clara, in private financial accounting, had spent or transferred the bulk of the American trust principal. The annual income that her mother had been unable to withhold had nevertheless dwindled because the principal had been chipped at, year by year, by a series of expensive performances, gifts, and travel. The Princesse de Caraman Chimay, who had been the most expensive American daughter of her Detroit cohort, had, by 1910, almost no money left. She continued to live in Italy. She was still recognizable. She still received small visits from the Italian press and small private letters from the children of her old social cohort in Detroit, who wrote with cautious curiosity. She did not return to America. She did not return to Belgium. She did not, so far as the documentary record indicates, ever again see her two children, Marie and Joseph, who by 1910 were 19 and 16, and had been raised in Belgium by the Caraman-Chimay grandparents. She had broken with the system that had bought her, completely and irreversibly. The system had then erased her, completely and irreversibly. She remained on the outside of it, a woman in late middle age in an Italian railway town, with a fourth husband and almost no money, but, by her own brief later account in a single Italian press interview, no significant regrets. She would have one more decade. Chapter 12. A Grave in Padua. No family attended. On the 9th of December, 1916, Clara Ward died of pneumonia in a quiet house in Padua, Italy, at the age of 43, and the Belgian children she had abandoned were instructed by their father's family not to attend. The death notice ran in the Italian provincial press the next day. It ran briefly in the Belgian press and, on the inside pages, in the New York Times. The Detroit Free Press carried a short paragraph that referred to her as the late Princess de Caraman-Chimay, and did not mention any of her subsequent husbands. She was buried 3 days later in Padua. The fourth husband and a small number of Italian neighbors attended. Her two Belgian children, Marie and Joseph, then 25 and 22, did not. Catherine Lyon Ward in Detroit did not. The Belgian Caraman-Chimay family did not. The Detroit Wards, the Bay City Wards, and the Cousins of Three States did not. She had 4 people at her grave. This is the structural fact this documentary has been building towards. A geriatric ward in Northampton, 1977. A nursing home in Santa Monica, 1967. A grave in Padua, 1916. 3 women, 3 institutions, 3 quiet endings. The Boldini portrait of Gladys Deacon, painted in 1908, hangs in the Petit Palais in Paris. Tens of thousands of visitors stand in front of it every year. None of them know what happened to the woman in the painting. The Charles Dana Gibson drawing of Evelyn Nesbit, titled The Eternal Question, is reproduced every year in textbooks of the history of American advertising. None of those textbooks discuss what happened to the woman in the drawing. The Rigo Jansi pastry, a small square chocolate cream cake named in 1898 in tribute to the elopement of Clara Ward, is on the menu of every traditional cafe in Budapest. None of the people eating it know that the woman the pastry was named for died, at 43, in a small house in Padua with 4 people at her grave. The system that traded these women is still running. It has new names, it has new platforms, it has new currencies. The asset class it is interested in has not changed at all. It is still interested in young women whose faces print well, whose presence at the dinner sells the dinner, whose name on the line of a contract permits a financial transfer to flow through them and onto the people who actually own the deeds. The system was not destroyed by the 20th century. It was rebranded. This is what these 3 lives, taken together, demonstrate. Gladys did everything correctly. She married the highest title available. She managed her face with the care of a Wall Street trustee. She conducted herself with absolute discretion, and at 81, she was put into a public ward by a trustee's signature for 15 years. Evelyn did almost nothing correctly. She was raised inside an American visual industry that owned her face from the moment she was 8. She was processed through a 47-year-old architect's bedroom at 16. She married a paranoid sadist at 20. She testified in the trial of the century at 21. And at 82, she died in a Santa Monica nursing home with under $7,000. Clara did the unthinkable thing. She broke. She walked out. She refused the bargain. She traded the principle of her own value before anybody else could trade it for her. At 43, she died in Padua, in a railway town, with 4 people at her grave. The system did not punish Gladys for following the rules. The system did not punish Evelyn for being too poor to have any rules. The system did not punish Clara for breaking the rules. The system used all 3 of them in the period when each of them was useful to it, and discarded all 3 of them in the period when each was no longer useful. The discard was structural. The discard had been arranged from the beginning. The system that warehoused them looks today very different. It looks like an advertising campaign. It looks like a modeling agency. It looks like a music label. It looks like a content platform. It looks like a private dinner at a Manhattan restaurant where a 30-year-old man with a great deal of money is taking a particular interest in a 20-year-old woman who is sitting opposite him in a dress she could not have afforded 6 months ago. The vocabulary has been polished. The structure is the same. The Dukes have become founders. The architects have become managers. The princes have become producers. The Florodora Sextet has become whatever the equivalent floor at the equivalent club happens to be on the night. This is what looking at 3 Gilded Age beauties is for. It is not to feel sorry for them. They would not have wanted us to. Gladys would have considered our pity an insult. Evelyn would have considered it a coal of comfort she could not have used. Clara would have considered it laughable. The point is to see, in the slow, careful destruction of 3 women across 3 decades and 3 countries, the actual shape of a system that we still inhabit, that has not been dismantled, and that produces every year, in our own time, women whose names are not yet known, but whose lives will run, with depressing accuracy, along the same 3 rails. Gladys was the woman who tried to follow every rule. Evelyn was the woman who never had a chance to follow any rule. Clara was the woman who tried to break every rule. The system used all 3. The system used them up. The system threw them away. The viewer should leave with one uncomfortable question. The system has new faces in it today. The system is running through somebody in your own country, in your own city, in this current decade, whose name you do not know yet, but whose life is being arranged along these 3 rails right now. You will hear the name eventually. You will hear it when the trust is filed, or the trial begins, or the obituary runs. The question is not whether the next Gladys, the next Evelyn, the next Clara exists. The question is whether you are willing to recognize her when you encounter her in your own time, before the system that owns her finishes with her. If this story moved you, hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. And tell me in the comments which of the 3 women you would most want to spend an evening with, knowing what you now know about how their evenings ended. I read every reply.